The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late April, and I knew before opening it that my quiet life on the farm was about to get a whole lot more complicated. I had been living on my family's property in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania for 8 years, tending to my chickens, goats, and a small herd of cattle just like my grandfather had done for decades before me. The letter was from something called the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association, and it informed me that I was being fined $200 per day for violations related to livestock odor, noise pollution, and aesthetic concerns. I read the letter 3 times, standing in my driveway with my German shepherd, Duke, sitting at my feet. My name is Vincent Thorne, and I had never even heard of Meadowbrook Heights until about 2 years ago when construction started on the empty land adjacent to my property. The farm had been in my family since 1952, passed down from my grandfather to my father, and then to me when Dad passed away in 2018. We had always raised livestock here, and the smell of manure and hay was as natural to me as breathing. The letter stated that I had violated multiple covenants and restrictions, which was absurd because I was not part of any homeowners association. I owned my land outright, all 43 acres of it, and I had been here long before anyone decided to build their fancy suburban development next door. The fine totaled $1,400 for the past week alone, with a threat of legal action if I did not comply with their demands to remove all livestock from the property within 30 days. I walked back into my farmhouse, the screen door slamming behind me as I tossed the letter onto my kitchen table. Duke followed me inside, his nails clicking on the hardwood floors. I needed to call my lawyer, but first I wanted to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I grabbed my laptop and searched for information about Meadowbrook Heights. What I found made my blood pressure rise. The development had broken ground in early 2024, and by late 2025, over 60 homes had been built on what used to be the old Henderson property. The Hendersons had sold their land to a developer called Sunrise Communities after old Mr. Henderson died, and his kids wanted nothing to do with farming. The lots were small, maybe a quarter acre each, with houses packed together like sardines. The marketing materials showed smiling families in front of cookie-cutter colonial-style homes with promises of a pool, playground, and strict community standards. I scrolled through their website until I found the HOA board members. The president was listed as Barbara Whitmore, and her photo showed a woman in her late 40s with blonde hair, styled in that speak to the manager cut that had become a universal warning sign. The vice president was named Todd Brennan, and there were 3 other board members whose names I barely registered. What caught my attention was the section about community standards and the promise to maintain property values through rigorous enforcement of rules and regulations. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was my neighbor Jim Kowalski, who owned a dairy farm about 2 miles down the road. We had been friends since high school, and he had been dealing with suburban sprawl complaints for years as the area around us slowly transformed from agricultural land to housing developments. "Vinny, you see the letter?" Jim asked when I answered. "Just got it this morning. How did you know?" "Because I got one too, even though I am a mile away from their precious neighborhood. They are claiming the smell from my dairy operation is affecting their quality of life. I called my lawyer, and he said we need to document everything." "This is insane, Jim. My family has been here since Eisenhower was president. They built their houses knowing there was a working farm right next door." "Doesn't matter to them. They think because they have an HOA and some fancy lawyers, they can push us around. My attorney said this is happening all over Pennsylvania. People move to the country for the scenery and then complain about the reality of living near farms." We talked for another 20 minutes, sharing information and frustration. Jim gave me his lawyer's number, a guy named Michael Patterson who specialized in agricultural law and right-to-farm cases. I called Patterson's office immediately after hanging up with Jim, and his secretary scheduled me for an appointment the following morning. That afternoon, I went about my regular chores with a knot in my stomach. I fed the chickens, mucked out the goat pen, and checked on my cattle in the east pasture. Everything looked exactly as it had every other day for the past 8 years. My operation was clean, well-maintained, and completely legal. I had all the proper permits, my animals were healthy and well cared for, and I followed every regulation set forth by the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. As I was finishing up, I noticed a silver Mercedes SUV driving slowly past my property on the main road. It slowed down near my driveway, and I could see someone taking pictures through the window. The vehicle had a Meadowbrook Heights resident sticker on the windshield. I waved, but the car sped up and drove away. Duke growled low in his throat, sensing my tension. That evening, I sat on my front porch with a beer and watched the sunset over my fields. The sky turned orange and pink, and I could hear my cattle lowing softly in the distance. This was my home, my livelihood, and my heritage. I was not about to let some HOA push me off my own land. The next morning, I drove into downtown Lancaster to meet with Michael Patterson. His office was in a converted Victorian house near the courthouse with a small sign out front that read, Patterson and Associates. The waiting room was decorated with agricultural art and photos of Pennsylvania farmland. A friendly receptionist led me back to Patterson's office, where a man in his mid-50s stood to shake my hand. Mr. Thorne, please have a seat. I have reviewed the letter you faxed over, and I have to say, this is one of the more aggressive HOA overreaches I have seen in recent months. Michael Patterson was a stocky man with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He had a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. We spent the next hour going over every detail of my situation. He asked about the history of my farm, my permits and licenses, the timeline of the Meadowbrook Heights development, and the exact nature of my livestock operation. Here's the bottom line, Vincent, Patterson said, leaning back in his chair. You have something called right to farm protection under Pennsylvania law. The Pennsylvania Right to Farm Act was specifically designed to protect agricultural operations from nuisance lawsuits when they are following proper procedures and were established before residential development. Your farm has been operating since 1952, and Meadowbrook Heights broke ground in 2024. They built next to you, not the other way around. So they cannot fine me? They have no jurisdiction over your property whatsoever. You are not part of their HOA. You never signed any covenants or agreements, and your land is separately deeded. This is harassment, plain and simple. However, these HOAs often have deep pockets and attorneys on retainer. They will try to bury you in paperwork and legal fees, hoping you will give up or settle. I am not giving up my farm. Good. Then here's what we are going to do. First, I'm going to draft a response letter informing the HOA that you are not subject to their authority and that any further harassment will result in legal action on our part. Second, I want you to document everything, every letter, every phone call, every incident. Take photos of your property, your livestock, and your operations. Keep records of all your permits and inspections. Third, I am going to file a preemptive motion with the county court to establish your right to farm protections formally. How much is this going to cost me? Patterson named a retainer fee that made me wince, but I knew I had no choice. I wrote him a check and left his office feeling slightly more optimistic. At least I had someone fighting in my corner. Over the next 2 weeks, things escalated quickly. I received 3 more letters from the HOA, each one increasing the fines and threatening immediate legal action. The total amount they claimed I owed was now over $8,000. Patterson sent his response letter, but the HOA ignored it completely. Then, the complaints started coming to the township. Someone from Meadowbrook Heights filed a formal complaint with the Lancaster County Health Department, claiming my farm was creating a public health hazard. An inspector named Sarah Chen showed up on a Thursday morning with a clipboard and a very apologetic expression. Mr. Thorne, I am really sorry about this, she said as we walked around my property. I've been getting about 3 calls a day from residents in that new development. They are convinced your farm is violating health codes. Is it? Sarah laughed. Not even close. Your operation is actually cleaner than most farms I inspect. Your animals are healthy, you have proper waste management, and everything is up to code. I'm going to write that in my report, but I doubt it will stop the complaints. What else can they do? Well, they could try to get the township to change zoning laws, but that is a long shot since this area has been zoned agricultural for over 70 years. They could sue you directly, but your lawyer probably told you about right to farm protections. Mostly, they will just make your life miserable with complaints and harassment. Sarah finished her inspection and gave me a clean report. I made copies of everything and sent them to Patterson. But the harassment continued. I started getting phone calls at all hours, some from blocked numbers, with people yelling about the smell or threatening to sue me. Someone filed a complaint with the USDA, triggering another inspection. Again, I passed with flying colors. The breaking point came on a Saturday in mid-May. I woke up to find that someone had spray-painted "Move Your Farm" in large red letters across my fence facing the main road. Duke was barking frantically, and when I went outside, I saw tire tracks in the mud near my driveway. Whoever did it had come during the night. I called the police, and a young officer named Tom Bradford came out to take a report. He photographed the vandalism and took my statement, but he was honest about the chances of catching whoever did it. Without cameras or witnesses, it is going to be tough, Mr. Thorne. I would suggest installing some security cameras, especially along your property line with the development. I took his advice and spent the next day installing a camera system that covered my driveway, barn, and the fence line closest to Meadowbrook Heights. The cameras had night vision and motion detection, and they fed directly to an app on my phone. The following Tuesday, I got a call from Patterson with news that the HOA had filed a lawsuit against me in Lancaster County Court. They were seeking an injunction to force me to remove all livestock from my property, plus damages of over $50,000 for diminished property values in their development. The lawsuit named me personally and also attempted to claim that my farm was a public nuisance. That's right. They are not messing around, Patterson said over the phone, but neither are we. I have already drafted our response, and I am going to file a countersuit for harassment and abuse of process. We have a strong case, Vincent, but you need to prepare yourself for a fight. The next few weeks were a blur of legal documents, depositions, and stress. The HOA's attorney was a shark named Gregory Hammond from a big firm in Philadelphia. He showed up to my deposition with 3 associates and enough paperwork to fill a small truck. They asked me hundreds of questions about my farm operations, my finances, and my intentions for the property. Patterson coached me through it all, reminding me to stay calm and answer only what was asked. The deposition took 2 full days, and by the end of it, I was exhausted. But I had told the truth about everything, and I had nothing to hide. Meanwhile, the campaign against me intensified. Residents from Meadowbrook Heights started showing up at township meetings to complain about my farm. I attended one meeting in early June and watched as Barbara Whitmore stood at the podium, her face red with indignation. "This farm is destroying our property values," she announced to the township supervisors. "We paid good money for our homes, and we should not have to smell manure every time we step outside. The township needs to do something about this nuisance." About 15 other residents stood up to voice their support, each one more dramatic than the last. One woman claimed the smell was making her children sick. A man said he could not have barbecues in his backyard anymore. Another woman complained that the flies from my farm were invading her home. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the podium with my hands shaking. Public speaking had never been my strong suit, but I needed to defend myself. "My name is Vincent Thorne, and my family has been farming this land since 1952, I began. That is 74 years of continuous agricultural use. I have all the proper permits, I follow all regulations, and I have passed every inspection with flying colors. I am sorry that some residents do not like living near a working farm, but this land was here first. I am not going anywhere." The room erupted in boos and shouts from the Meadowbrook Heights contingent. The township supervisor, an older man named Richard Moss, banged his gavel for order. "Let me be clear about something," Supervisor Moss said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Mr. Thorne's property is properly zoned for agricultural use, and he is in full compliance with all township ordinances. This board has no authority to shut down a legal farming operation, and we would not do so even if we could. Pennsylvania's Right to Farm Act exists specifically to protect farmers like Mr. Thorne from this exact situation." Barbara Whitmore practically exploded. "This is outrageous. We are taxpayers too. Our voices matter." "Your voices do matter, Mrs. Whitmore, but so does the law. If you chose to buy a home next to a farm, then you need to accept the realities of farm life. This meeting is adjourned." I left the township building feeling vindicated but also worried. These people were relentless, and they clearly had money to burn on legal fees. How long could I afford to keep fighting? As if reading my mind, Patterson called me the next morning with an update. I have good news and bad news. The good news is that the judge assigned to our case is Honor Margaret Sullivan. She is fair-minded and has a background in agricultural law. The bad news is that the HOA has amended their lawsuit to include additional claims. They are now alleging that dust from your property is damaging their vehicles and that your roosters are creating noise pollution. Roosters. I have 3 roosters and they crow at dawn. That is what roosters do. I know, Vincent. They are throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. But we have a hearing scheduled for July 15th to address their request for a preliminary injunction. If we win that, it will seriously weaken their case. July the 15th seemed both too far away and too soon. I spent the intervening weeks documenting everything, just as Patterson had instructed. I took daily photos of my property, recorded the times my roosters crowed, and kept a detailed log of every interaction with HOA members or Meadowbrook Heights residents. My security cameras proved invaluable. 3 different times I caught people from the development trespassing on my property. Once, I recorded 2 teenagers throwing rocks at my chickens. Another time, I caught Barbara Whitmore herself walking around my barn with her phone out, taking pictures. Each incident was documented and sent to Patterson. The harassment extended beyond my property. Someone left a 1-star review on the farm's Facebook page, claiming I abused my animals. It was completely false, and I had to spend hours responding and providing proof from my veterinary records. Anonymous accounts started posting negative comments on local community forums, painting me as a stubborn old farmer who refused to adapt to changing times. I was only 34 years old, but facts did not seem to matter to these people. Jim Kowalski checked in with me regularly, offering support and advice. His own legal battle with the HOA had reached a stalemate, with his lawyer successfully getting the fines dismissed, but the complaints continuing. We met for coffee one morning at a diner in downtown Lancaster, and he looked as tired as I felt. "These HOA people are something else," Jim said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "My wife wants me to just sell the farm and move somewhere more rural, but that is exactly what they want. If they can force us out, they can develop this land too. That is what this is really about, is it not? They want our land." Absolutely. I did some digging, and Sunrise Communities has been buying up every available parcel in this area. If they could get their hands on your 43 acres and my 120, they could build another 300 homes easy. That is millions of dollars in profit. The thought made me sick. My grandfather had worked this land his entire life. My father had continued that legacy. I was not about to let some greedy developers and entitled homeowners destroy everything my family had built. The hearing on July 15th arrived faster than I wanted. Patterson and I met at the courthouse early in the morning, going over our strategy one final time. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and high ceilings. Judge Margaret Sullivan was a woman in her 60s with short silver hair and a serious expression. The HOA was represented by Gregory Hammond and his team of associates. Barbara Whitmore sat in the front row, along with about a dozen other residents from Meadowbrook Heights. I recognized several faces from the township meeting. Judge Sullivan called the court to order and asked Hammond to present his case for a preliminary injunction. He stood up, buttoning his expensive suit jacket, and launched into a dramatic presentation about how my farm was destroying the quality of life for over 60 families. "Your Honor, the defendant's farming operation creates an unbearable stench that permeates the entire Meadowbrook Heights community," Hammond argued. "Our residents cannot enjoy their properties, their home values have declined, and they are suffering daily because of Mr. Thorne's stubborn refusal to be a good neighbor." He presented affidavits from multiple residents, including one from a woman who claimed the smell was so bad she had to keep her windows closed all summer. Another resident testified that the crowing roosters woke her up every morning at 5 a.m. A man claimed that dust from my property had ruined the paint on his new Tesla. Hammond painted a picture of me as an inconsiderate, outdated relic who was holding back progress. He argued that modern society required people to compromise, and that I should be required to either significantly reduce my livestock or relocate my operations. When it was Patterson's turn, he calmly dismantled every argument. He started by presenting the history of my farm, complete with property records dating back to 1952. He showed photos of the empty land that later became Meadowbrook Heights, proving that the development was built adjacent to an existing farm. "Your Honor, this is a textbook case of coming to the nuisance," Patterson explained. "Mr. Thorne's farm was operating legally for over 70 years before a single house was built in Meadowbrook Heights. Pennsylvania's Right to Farm Act specifically protects agricultural operations in exactly this situation. The plaintiffs chose to purchase homes next to a working farm. They do not get to turn around and complain about the natural consequences of that decision." Patterson presented documentation from every inspection, showing that my farm was in full compliance with all regulations. He showed the clean reports from the Health Department, the USDA, and the township. He presented evidence of the harassment I had endured, including the vandalism photos and security camera footage of trespassers. Then, he called me to testify. I walked to the witness stand with my heart pounding, placed my hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Patterson asked me questions about my farm, my family history, and my operations. I explained how my grandfather had started with just a few chickens and a dairy cow, and how the farm had grown over the decades. I talked about the pride I took in maintaining the property and caring for my animals. I described the harassment and stress of the past few months. "Mr. Thorne, do you have any intention of removing your livestock or ceasing your farming operations?" Patterson asked. "No, sir. This is my home and my livelihood. My family has worked this land for 3 generations, and I plan to continue that legacy." Then it was Hammond's turn to cross-examine me. He tried to rattle me with aggressive questions about odors and noise, but I stayed calm and told the truth. Yes, farms sometimes smell like manure. Yes, roosters crow at dawn. These are basic facts of agricultural life, not violations of law. Hammond brought up the complaint filed by the woman who claimed her children were getting sick. I explained that the health department had investigated and found no health hazards. He asked about property values, and I pointed out that people who buy homes near farms should expect farm-related sights, sounds, and smells. After over an hour of testimony, Judge Sullivan called for a break. Patterson and I stepped outside into the courthouse hallway, and he gave me a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "You did great in there. Just stay steady." When we returned to the courtroom, Hammond called Barbara Whitmore to testify. She walked to the stand with her head held high, wearing a navy blue dress and pearls. She painted herself as a reasonable person who had tried to work with me, but been met with hostility. "I approached Mr. Thorne multiple times to discuss possible compromises," Barbara said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I suggested that perhaps he could move his livestock to the far side of his property, away from our homes. I offered to have the HOA contribute financially to help him make changes, but he refused every reasonable suggestion." This was a complete fabrication. Barbara had never approached me with any offers or compromises. Every interaction had been hostile from the start. Patterson objected to her testimony as hearsay and lack of foundation, and Judge Sullivan sustained most of his objections. When Patterson cross-examined Barbara, he was surgical in his questioning. "Mrs. Whitmore, when did you purchase your home in Meadowbrook Heights?" "March 2025. "And when you were shopping for homes, did your real estate agent inform you that there was an active farm adjacent to the development?" Barbara hesitated. "Well, yes, but we were told it was a small operation." "Did you visit the property before purchasing?" "Yes." "And did you smell any odors during that visit?" "It was winter, so not really." "But you were aware that farms create odors, were you not?" "I suppose so, but I did not think it would be this bad." Patterson continued to press her on what she reasonably should have expected when buying a home next to a farm. He asked about the HOA's attempts to purchase my property, which Barbara initially denied until Patterson produced emails between HOA board members discussing exactly that strategy. "Mrs. Whitmore, is it true that the HOA board discussed trying to force Mr. Thorne to sell his property so that Sunrise Communities could develop it?" "That is taken out of context," Barbara sputtered. "Is it true or not?" "We discussed it as a possibility. But that is not why we filed this lawsuit. Patterson let the answer hang in the air for a moment before sitting down. The damage was done. Judge Sullivan had seen that the HOA's real motivation might not be quality of life issues, but rather a desire to acquire valuable land. The hearing lasted until late afternoon. Both sides presented their closing arguments, and then Judge Sullivan announced she would take the matter under advisement and issue a written decision within 2 weeks. Patterson and I left the courthouse cautiously optimistic. "I think we made a strong showing," he said as we stood in the parking lot. Judge Sullivan seemed skeptical of the HOA's claims, especially after Barbara's testimony about discussing your property acquisition. The wait for the decision was agonizing. I tried to focus on my farm work, but every day felt like an eternity. I checked my phone constantly, waiting for Patterson's call. Finally, on July 28th, Patterson called with the news. "Vincent, we won. Judge Sullivan denied the preliminary injunction. Her written opinion is 23 pages long, and she absolutely dismantled the HOA's arguments." I had to sit down. Duke came over and put his head on my knee, sensing my emotion. What did she say?" "She found that you are clearly protected under Pennsylvania's Right to Farm Act, that the HOA has no jurisdiction over your property, and that their claims of nuisance fail as a matter of law because they came to you, not the other way around." She was particularly harsh about the HOA's tactics, noting that their attempts to acquire your property undermine their claims that this lawsuit is about quality of life issues. She also ordered them to cease all harassment and threatened sanctions if they continue to pursue frivolous claims. Does this mean the lawsuit is over? Not quite. They could still proceed to trial on their damage claims, but without the injunction, they have no leverage, and Judge Sullivan's opinion will make it very difficult for them to win anything at trial. My guess is they will either drop the lawsuit or try to settle for nuisance value. Patterson was right. 2 weeks later, Hammond contacted him with a settlement offer. The HOA would drop all claims and pay $15,000 toward my legal fees if I agreed not to expand my livestock operations and to implement some basic odor control measures. Patterson advised me to reject the offer. "They are trying to buy your silence and put restrictions on your property. You do not need to agree to anything. We have them on the ropes." I followed his advice and rejected the settlement. In response, the HOA filed a motion to appeal Judge Sullivan's decision, but it was quickly denied by the appellate court. The case was scheduled for trial in October, but as the date approached, Hammond sent another message. The HOA was voluntarily dismissing their lawsuit. It was over. I had won. But the victory felt hollow in some ways. The harassment had not completely stopped. I still got dirty looks from Meadowbrook Heights residents when I drove past their development. Someone left a nasty note on my truck windshield at the grocery store. The anonymous online complaints continued. Then, in late September, something unexpected happened. I was out checking on my cattle one evening when I noticed a woman standing by my fence, looking at my animals. She was not from Meadowbrook Heights based on her clothing, which was practical and worn. As I approached, she smiled. "I'm sorry for intruding," she said. "I'm Helen Everett. I just moved into one of the houses in Meadowbrook Heights, and I wanted to introduce myself." I was immediately wary, but Helen seemed genuine. She was probably in her early 30s with brown hair pulled back in a ponytail and kind eyes. "Vincent Thorne," I said, shaking her hand cautiously. "I know who you are. I've heard all about the lawsuit. For what it is worth, I think the HOA was completely out of line. I grew up on a farm in Ohio, and when I saw this place, I was actually excited to live near a working farm again. But apparently, that makes me weird according to my neighbors." We talked for about 30 minutes. And I learned that Helen was a veterinarian who had just opened a practice in Lancaster. She had bought her house before learning about the controversy, and she was already butting heads with the HOA over various issues. "Barbara Whitmore sent me a violation notice because I planted vegetables in my front yard," Helen said with a laugh. "Apparently, only ornamental plants are allowed. I told her to take a hike." Helen became an unexpected ally. She started speaking out at HOA meetings, defending my right to farm and pushing back against the anti-farm contingent. She also helped me with my animals, offering free vet services and advice on livestock management. Through Helen, I learned that not everyone in Meadowbrook Heights was against me. There was a silent minority of residents who either did not care about the farm or actually appreciated it. They were just too intimidated by Barbara and her crew to speak up. In October, the HOA held their annual election for board members. Helen decided to run for a position, campaigning on a platform of common sense and respecting property rights. To everyone's surprise, including her own, she won a seat on the board. Barbara Whitmore was re-elected as president, but her margin of victory was much narrower than in previous years. With Helen on the inside, I started getting information about the HOA's activities. She told me that Barbara was still obsessed with getting rid of my farm, but that other board members were tired of the legal expenses and bad publicity. The HOA had spent over $200,000 on the failed lawsuit, money that came out of residents' HOA fees. People were starting to ask questions about whether it had been worth it. In November, something happened that changed everything. I was reviewing footage from my security cameras just as part of my regular routine when I noticed something suspicious. On 3 different occasions over the past 2 weeks, the same car had driven slowly past my property late at night, stopping near my barn. I zoomed in on the license plate and ran it through a database Jim had told me about. The car was registered to Todd Brennan, the HOA vice president. I kept watching the footage and saw that on the most recent occasion, someone got out of the car and walked toward my barn carrying something. I immediately called Patterson and the police. Officer Bradford came out the next day and reviewed the footage. His expression grew serious as he watched. "Mr. Thorne, I think you might have someone casing your property for vandalism or worse. I'm going to increase patrols in this area, and I want you to keep your security system running 24/7. That weekend, my cameras caught exactly what Officer Bradford had feared. At 2 a.m. on Saturday night, Todd Brennan and another man I did not recognize pulled up to my property in a dark pickup truck. They got out carrying gasoline cans and what looked like rags. My phone's security app woke me with a motion alert. I watched the live feed in horror as the 2 men approached my barn. They were clearly planning to commit arson. I called 911 immediately while keeping my eyes on the screen. 911, what is your emergency? This is Vincent Thorne at 2847 Old Farm Road. There are 2 men on my property with gasoline cans, and I think they are about to set fire to my barn. The dispatcher kept me on the line while sending officers to my location. I grabbed my shotgun, not to confront the men, but to protect myself if needed. Duke was barking furiously, and I could see on the camera that the noise had startled the would-be arsonists. They were still trying to prepare their fire as starting materials when 3 police cars arrived, sirens blaring. The men tried to run, but officers tackled them before they could get back to their truck. I watched from my bedroom window as Todd Brennan and his accomplice were handcuffed and placed in separate patrol cars. Officer Bradford came to my door about 20 minutes later. "Mr. Thorne, we have got them both in custody. We found 2 5-gallon gasoline cans, rags, and a lighter in their possession. They are being charged with attempted arson and criminal trespassing. Your security footage is going to be crucial evidence." I spent the rest of the night giving my statement and providing copies of all my security footage to the police. As the sun came up, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, trying to process what had almost happened. They had tried to burn down my barn with my animals inside. The thought made me physically ill. The news spread through the community like wildfire. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about the attempted arson, complete with Todd Brennan's mugshot. The story detailed the ongoing conflict between the HOA and my farm, and public opinion began to shift dramatically in my favor. Helen called me later that morning. "Vincent, I am so sorry. I knew Barbara and Todd were obsessed with getting rid of your farm, but I never thought they would go this far. Barbara is claiming she knew nothing about it, but I do not believe her. Do the police think she was involved? I do not know, but Todd's lawyer might try to make a deal by giving up information. If Barbara was part of planning this, she could be in serious trouble." Helen was right. Within a week, prosecutors charged Todd Brennan and his accomplice, a man named Kevin Marsh who owned a home in Meadowbrook Heights, with attempted arson and criminal conspiracy. Facing significant prison time, Todd agreed to cooperate with investigators. His statement was damning. He told prosecutors that Barbara Whitmore had repeatedly expressed her desire to force me off my property and had suggested various illegal tactics, including vandalism and arson. According to Todd, Barbara had never explicitly ordered him to burn down my barn, but she had made it clear that she would be grateful if something happened to make my farm unprofitable. The district attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia Rodriguez, took the case seriously. She launched an investigation into Barbara's involvement and subpoenaed all HOA records, including emails and text messages. What they found was shocking. Barbara had been coordinating a systematic harassment campaign against me for months. She had encouraged residents to file false complaints, had orchestrated the vandalism of my fence, and had even discussed with Todd the possibility of contaminating my water supply or releasing my livestock onto the road. In December, Barbara Whitmore was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit arson, criminal harassment, and stalking. The local news coverage was extensive, and Barbara's perp walk became a viral video online. The woman who had presented herself as a defender of property values and community standards was exposed as someone willing to commit serious crimes to get her way. The arrests had an immediate impact on Meadowbrook Heights. The remaining HOA board members held an emergency meeting and voted to remove Barbara from her position as president. They also issued a formal apology to me and announced that the HOA would no longer pursue any actions against my farm. Helen was elected as the new HOA president in a special election, running unopposed. One of her first acts was to organize a community meeting where she invited me to speak. I was hesitant at first, but she convinced me it was important. The meeting was held in early January at the Meadowbrook Heights Clubhouse. About 40 residents attended, a mix of people who had supported the lawsuit and those who had remained neutral. I stood at the front of the room with my hands shaking, facing the same people who had made my life miserable for months. "I am not going to pretend that the past year has been easy," I began. "Some of you have called me names, filed false complaints, and made it clear that you wanted me gone. But I also know that not everyone here feels that way. Some of you are new to the area and did not know what you were getting into when you bought your homes. Some of you appreciate having a farm nearby. And some of you just want to live in peace." I explained the history of my farm, the importance of agricultural preservation, and the reality of Pennsylvania's right to farm laws. I talked about my animals, my operations, and the measures I took to be a responsible steward of the land. "I am not going anywhere," I said firmly. "This is my home, and it was here long before your houses were built. But I am also willing to be a good neighbor to those who are willing to do the same. If you have legitimate concerns about my operations, come talk to me directly. Do not file false complaints or spread lies online. Treat me with respect, and I will do the same for you." The response was mixed, but mostly positive. A few people stood up and apologized for their behavior. Others asked genuine questions about farming practices and what to expect living near agricultural operations. One woman thanked me for continuing to farm despite everything I had endured. After the meeting, several residents came up to shake my hand. One couple asked if they could bring their kids to visit the farm sometime to learn about agriculture. I agreed, and over the next few months I started hosting occasional educational visits for families from Meadowbrook Heights and other nearby neighborhoods. The criminal cases moved forward. Todd Brennan pleaded guilty to attempted arson and received a sentence of 5 years in prison. Kevin Marsh received a similar sentence. Barbara Whitmore went to trial in March, and I testified about the harassment and threats I had endured. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding Barbara guilty on all counts. Judge Sullivan, the same judge who had dismissed the HOA's lawsuit, sentenced Barbara to 7 years in prison. In her sentencing remarks, Judge Sullivan was scathing. "You abused your position of authority in your community to orchestrate a campaign of harassment and intimidation against a law-abiding citizen," Judge Sullivan said. "Your actions went beyond simple neighborly disputes into criminal territory. You put lives at risk, both human and animal, because you valued your personal preferences over the rights and safety of others. This court has no tolerance for such behavior." Watching Barbara led out of the courtroom in handcuffs brought me no joy. It was simply justice being served. She had made choices that led her to this moment, and now she had to face the consequences. The civil lawsuit was not quite over, though. Patterson filed a lawsuit on my behalf against the Meadowbrook Heights HOA for harassment, emotional distress, and legal expenses. The case settled out of court in April for $275,000. The settlement included a permanent agreement that the HOA would never again take any action against my farm and would formally recognize my right to farm protections in their governing documents. I used some of the settlement money to upgrade my farm operations and install better fencing along the property line with Meadowbrook Heights. I also donated $50,000 to a Pennsylvania agricultural preservation fund that helped other farmers facing similar situations. Life slowly returned to normal. The harassment stopped completely. Some residents from Meadowbrook Heights became regular customers, buying eggs, milk, and occasionally beef from my farm. Helen became a close friend, and her veterinary expertise proved invaluable for keeping my animals healthy. Jim Kowalski's situation also improved. With the precedent set by my case, the complaints against his dairy farm dried up, and he was able to focus on his business without constant legal threats. In May, almost exactly a year after the initial conflict began, I stood in my fields watching my cattle graze in the late afternoon sun. Duke was at my side, and the air smelled like fresh hay and earth. The sounds of suburban life drifted over from Meadowbrook Heights, but they no longer felt threatening. The lawnmowers, children playing, and cars coming and going were just background noise to the life I had always lived. My phone buzzed with a text from Helen. She was asking if I wanted to come to a barbecue at her place that weekend. A year ago, I never would have imagined socializing with anyone from that development. Now, I had friends there. I thought about my grandfather, who had worked this land through economic depressions and personal hardships, never giving up on the life he had built. I thought about my father, who had continued that legacy through his own challenges. They had both taught me that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds seem impossible. The farm was more than just property or a business. It was a connection to the past and a promise to the future. It represented a way of life that was increasingly rare in modern America, but no less valuable for its scarcity. Agricultural land was being converted to suburban sprawl at an alarming rate, and every farmer who gave up was another piece of our heritage lost. I had nearly lost everything because a group of people decided their comfort was more important than my rights. They had used legal intimidation, harassment, and ultimately criminal acts to try to force me out. But the system, flawed as it sometimes was, had ultimately worked. The law protected my right to continue farming, and those who broke the law faced real consequences. The experience had taught me important lessons about standing up for what is right, even when it is difficult. It had shown me that not everyone who seems like an enemy really is one, and that allies can come from unexpected places. It had reminded me that community is built on mutual respect, not on forcing everyone to conform to one vision of how life should be lived. As the sun set over my fields, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the land I was privileged to steward, for the animals I cared for the legal system that protected my rights, and for the people who had stood by me when things got tough. I walked back to my farmhouse, where I would cook dinner, review the next day's chores, and maybe watch some television before bed. It was an ordinary evening, the kind I had experienced thousands of times before, but after everything I'd been through, ordinary felt extraordinary. The fight had been hard, but I had won not just in court but in principle. My farm remained exactly where it belonged, and no HOA or suburban development would ever change that. The judge had said it clearly. They built next to a farm, and they would have to live with what that meant. As I opened my front door, and Duke trotted inside ahead of me, I smiled. This was home. This was where I belonged, and this was where I would stay. For as long as the land would have me, continuing the work that my grandfather started 74 years ago and ensuring that it would be here for another 74 years to come. The legal battle might be over, but the real victory was simpler than that. I had defended my right to live the life I chose, in the place I loved, doing the work that mattered to me. In a world that increasingly demanded conformity and compromise, I had proven that it was still possible to stand your ground and win. The Meadowbrook Heights development would continue to grow and change. New families would move in, and some would leave. The HOA would elect new leaders and face new challenges. But my farm would remain, a constant reminder that not everything old needs to be replaced with something new, and that some traditions are worth preserving. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where my grandfather used to sit and plan his days. The wood was worn smooth from decades of use, marked with the rings from countless coffee cups and the scratches from daily life. It was solid, reliable, and real, just like the life I was determined to protect. The certified letter that had arrived on that Tuesday morning in April had seemed like the beginning of the end. Instead, it had been the start of a fight that would define me and test everything I believed in. I had emerged victorious, but more importantly, I had emerged with my integrity intact and my purpose reaffirmed. As I sat there in the quiet of my home, I realized that the story was not really about me versus an HOA. It was about the broader conflict between different visions of American life. On one side were those who valued homogeneity, predictability, and control, who wanted to shape their environment to match their expectations. On the other side were those who valued tradition, independence, and the freedom to live according to their own choices, even if those choices did not conform to someone else's standards. Both visions had their place in America, but they needed to coexist with mutual respect and understanding of the law. What the HOA had failed to understand was that their preferences did not trump my rights, and that choosing to live near a farm meant accepting what came with that choice. The next morning, I woke early as always and went about my chores. The cattle needed feeding, the chickens needed tending, and the fence in the south pasture needed repair. It was honest work, the kind that left you tired but satisfied at the end of the day. As I worked, I noticed a car pull into my driveway. I recognized it as belonging to one of the newer residents from Meadowbrook Heights, a young couple with a toddler. The husband got out and waved. "Mr. Thorne, I hope I am not disturbing you. My name is David Chen. My wife and I moved here a few months ago, and we heard about everything you went through. We wanted to apologize for being part of a community that treated you so badly." "You were not part of it," I said, shaking his hand. "You just moved here. Still, we benefit from living here, and we want you to know that we appreciate having your farm nearby. My son loves watching your cows from our backyard. Would it be okay if we brought him to visit sometime? We would love to teach him about where his food comes from." "Sure, anytime. Just give me a call first." David thanked me and left, and I returned to my work with a smile. These small interactions, these moments of genuine human connection, were worth more than any settlement check or legal victory. They represented the possibility of a real community, one built on understanding rather than conflict. Over the following months, my farm became something of a local attraction. School groups came for educational tours, families visited to buy fresh eggs and learn about sustainable agriculture. I even hired a part-time helper, a young man named Marcus who was studying agriculture at Penn State and wanted hands-on experience. The publicity from the legal case had an unexpected benefit. People were interested in supporting local farms. My customer base grew, and I was able to expand my operations modestly while still maintaining the same standards of quality and animal welfare that my grandfather had established. Helen continued to serve as HOA president and worked to transform Meadowbrook Heights into a more balanced community. She organized events that brought together longtime rural residents and newer suburban transplants. She revised the HOA rules to be less draconian and more focused on genuine community building rather than petty enforcement. One evening in late summer, Helen stopped by with a proposition. "Vincent, I have been thinking. What if we partnered on an educational program? We could offer classes about farming, sustainability, and rural life. I could teach about animal care from a veterinary perspective, and you could teach about the practical aspects of farming. We could hold them at the clubhouse and invite everyone in the area." I thought about it for a moment and then agreed. The program launched that fall and was surprisingly popular. We had 30 people sign up for the first session, ranging from curious suburbanites to aspiring homesteaders. Teaching people about my way of life, answering their questions, and sharing my knowledge felt meaningful in a way I had not expected. As the seasons changed and another year passed, the conflict that had once dominated my life became a memory. The farm thrived, the community improved, and the lessons learned from that difficult period shaped how I approached everything going forward. I never forgot how close I had come to losing everything, and I never took for granted the protections that the law had provided. I became active in agricultural advocacy, speaking at township meetings and state legislature sessions about the importance of right-to-farm laws and the need to protect agricultural land from unchecked development. My story resonated with farmers across Pennsylvania and beyond. I received letters and emails from people facing similar situations, and I tried to offer advice and support where I could. Some battles were won, others were lost, but every farmer who stood their ground made it easier for the next person to do the same. The farm that my grandfather had established in 1952 continued into its 8th decade of operation, and I was determined to ensure it would see many more. I had no children of my own yet, but I hoped that someday I would pass this land on to the next generation, along with the lessons I had learned about perseverance, principle, and the importance of standing up for what you believe in. Looking back on the whole experience, from that first certified letter to the final settlement, I realized that it had changed me in fundamental ways. I was stronger, more confident, and more connected to my community than I had been before. The adversity had not broken me. It had refined me, burning away doubts and fears and leaving behind a clearer sense of who I was and what mattered to me. The attempted arson had been the lowest point, the moment when the conflict escalated from annoying to genuinely dangerous. But it had also been the turning point, the moment when the community saw the HOA's true nature and when the legal system finally took decisive action. Barbara Whitmore, Todd Brennan, and Kevin Marsh were all serving their prison sentences, and I did not waste energy on bitterness or resentment toward them. They had made their choices, and they were facing the consequences. My focus was on moving forward, not dwelling on the past. The settlement money had provided financial security and allowed me to make improvements I had been putting off for years. But more valuable than the money was the precedent the case had set. Future farmers in Pennsylvania would be able to point to Judge Sullivan's decision and know that their rights would be protected. As another spring arrived, bringing with it the renewal that always characterized this time of year on the farm, I stood in the same spot where I had stood when that first letter arrived. Duke, older now but still loyal, sat at my feet. The fields were green with new growth, the animals were healthy, and the air smelled like promise. Meadowbrook Heights still bordered my property, but it no longer felt like enemy territory. Lights twinkled in the windows of the houses as families settled in for dinner. Children played in backyards, someone was grilling, and the smell of charcoal mixed with the farm smells in a way that spoke to coexistence rather than conflict. My phone rang, and I answered to hear Jim Kowalski's familiar voice. "Vinny, you watching the news? They are doing a story about agricultural preservation, and they mentioned your case." I promised to watch it later and ended the call. The media attention had been intense for a while, but it had mostly died down now. I was fine with that. I'd never wanted to be famous or make headlines. I just wanted to farm my land in peace. As darkness fell and the stars began to appear, I walked back to my house, thinking about all the generations of farmers who had looked up at these same stars and felt the same connection to the land. Farming was more than a job or even a lifestyle. It was a calling, a responsibility to steward the earth and provide for others. The fight with the HOA had tested that calling to its limits, but it had never broken. I had learned that justice, while sometimes slow, ultimately prevailed when you had the law on your side and the courage to stand firm. I had learned that communities were strongest when they embraced diversity, not just of people but of ways of life. I had learned that respect was earned through action, not demanded through authority. Most importantly, I had learned that my grandfather and father had been right all along. This land, this life, this work was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The farm would endure because I had refused to give up, and that refusal would echo through whatever future awaited. As I settled in for the night, with Duke snoring softly at the foot of my bed, I felt a profound sense of peace. The battle was over. The farm was safe, Justice had been served. And tomorrow I would wake up and do it all again, feed the animals, tend the land, and live the life that 3 generations of my family had built. The judge had said it best in her ruling. They built next to a farm, and they would have to accept what that meant. Those words had vindicated everything I stood for and protected everything I loved. In the end, that was all I had ever wanted. The freedom to continue the legacy my grandfather started 74 years ago, and the assurance that it would continue for 74 more.